Hey, okay. Well, I wanted to make a video. It's another Anton video, and this one is kind of about reflections on my thoughts about Anton and where I agree with him and where I disagree with him. Kind of like the new boundary lines of the conflict that I have with his presumptions, his philosophical presumptions, and to see whether or not anybody can jump in. To date, it doesn't seem as if anybody is jumping in, jumping on him for certain thoughts that he has, except for me. And I've made a big thing out of it, but at the same time, it's not about attacking him. It is about attacking the arguments and about trying to come to an understanding about the differences that I hold with him, and the things that I think are petty that he has seemed to have made a big deal out of. And so that has to do with like he made a video. So basically, what I'm going to do is just freeform a talk and try to make some criticism out of it, because these seem to be some of the points that are getting to me. Um, He made a video about literalness, and he talked about infinites and parallel lines and the number zero. And in the past, he's said that things are real, and then he's also put in the suffix of no things are real or nothing is real, trying to kind of skirt around the idea of imagination, get an idea of like the fact of imagination is real, but the items of imagination are not considered to be real in the same way that ostensible or empirical demonstrable items are considered real. Um, but let me back up to the idea of zero. The idea of zero for Anton seems to be such a big deal, that since we're on a base 10 system where it's 0 through 9, and then we add it, for whatever reason, that 0, which he says has no referent, to me, the 0 is pointing to absence as a placeholder for something. That first somebody recognizes a thing, and then they recognize that the thing is absent. And then when they look at the absence, if they make a boundary to the absence, then they have negation. But prior to negation, they have absence. Now, so in other words, this video is more or less for me to reflect at this time about where my differences are with Anton. Anton had left a quote on one of my videos from an author, and so the difference between Anton and I currently on the absence versus negation is that Anton believes that negation, the not operator, comes, I guess, in language prior to absence. And I think conceptually, not only is that incorrect, it doesn't, there's no intuition for me to believe that. I don't believe that the negation came before absence. I think in our natural day-to-day lives, if we know one thing is in a place and then we find that we're wrong and the thing is absent, that we recognize its absence before we recognize its not its so to speak, not presence. And this is very particular, and this is like this particular difference is core and key. This is a key difference, because if you believe that negation is prior to absence, then you're going to fall into this kind of this odd this funk that Anton's in about zeros, right? Where I take more of the Wittgenstein, the philosophical investigations, 143 approach, that when we are employing the word meaning, when we're seeking out what a word means, like zero, what we do is we look not for its referent by necessarily, but we look for its use. And so we bring up a meaning as use philosophy when we're seeking out the word meaning. Now, the idea that a zero has no referent kind of falls into this idea that Anton was bringing up about pi, or about infinities, and how he says, well, there's orders of infinity, but there's no infinities. We don't have a referent for infinities. And so I think about, and this comes back down to the notion of literalness. Well, if you look up etymologies of literal, not down to like lit and illumination and throwing light and casting light, but the idea of that which is literal versus that which is figurative, then literal apparently used to mean that which was part of natural language or a natural description of things, that which was empirical and demonstrable and referential. And then it became to be known for the strongest admissible use. So Anton says, well, there are no infinities, or there's no reference for infinities, there's no reference for zeros. Well, the referent for zero, or the use of zero, has to do with either counting on a base 10 system, where we throw in a numeral prior to 1 or after 9 in order to continue speaking of tens. Otherwise, we could speak on a base 9 system and go 1 through 9 and then go to 11 and just cut out 0. But we don't do that, so we have this zero, which is like a placeholder, but it's also that which defines the number. You know, it's part of a conglomerate number, 1 and a 0 to make 10, and that 10 has a referent that we point to in much the same way that we could point to a placeholder and say 0 has a placeholder, or 0 has a referent. And so what do I mean by that, or the infinities that we have references for infinity? What I want to do is I want to talk about the word literal now being the strongest natural use, and talk about Wittgenstein's meaning as use, to kind of clear this up, that infinity, the strongest possible use of infinity, let's say prior to a computer, would be some guy sitting in a corner counting, and that his whole job from sunup to sundown, or until he woke to when he slept, was to count. And all he could ever do is count, right? And that by the end of his life, he would reach this amazingly high number that nobody else had reached. And we would say, and so on, a continuance of this counting process. Or when I was in New York, I was staring at the national debt number wall. And so it's counting the debt. But it's just a number that's jumping up like by 50,000 numbers per second. And we say that that thing could go on infinitely. And it's not to say that the debt goes on infinitely, but we already know that orders of numbers or the counting process can continue to go. The faster computers we have that do the same natural, as much as computers are natural now, or that they take over the job of the guy sitting on the side of the road counting, that this is what it is we reference, or what it is we're referring to literally, to find the meaning of the word infinite, right? But now Anton has a problem with the word zero and the word infinite and the word pi. Now, kind of Wittgenstein, people say he kicked away the Tactratus, or he dismantled, or he rewrote his opinions about philosophy when he left the Tactratus to go to the philosophical investigations in his work on language after that. But he did not negate the Tractatus. He moved, the Tractatus was a crystalline logical approach to empiricism, and basically it was like a painter turning into a sculptor. And by that same accord, a perfect circle, the idea of perfection is referenced in the natural world kind of like this. If I say I have a perfect painting, how is that different than saying I have a perfect circle or a perfect sphere in sculpture, right? That the idea of perfection, we say, well, we can never reach a perfect circle, right? Even computers can't reach a perfect circle. But it's almost like the phrase, it's good enough for the government. It's good enough. When I draw it, if I have a classroom of kids and I say, now come up here and draw a circle, the one that appears to draw the circle closest to a circle, or where I can't just immediately see a problem with it, I say, oh, that's a perfect circle. Or even if it's an oval, I might say that's a perfect circle, meaning it's doing its job for all demonstrable senses. It's perfect for a particular context. And so this is the idea behind, I almost want to accuse Anton of being too literal about the word literal, right? That he is seeing the kids, and granted he's teaching college, and so he's trying to get over the idea like, well, look, there's a logical perfection in things, but there's not an empirical perfection in things. But then again, Wittgenstein brings up the foot measure tool in France, or the foot measure, or the meter rule stick in France, that is apparently on metal, and it's encased in a particular housing that has temperature control on it. And he's suggesting that a foot could change its length if the temperature went up, or if the person measuring one side of the tick measures the other side of the tick, and makes an adjustment when they're making all other meters off of this meter stick, that they could be off, or that the temperature could rise a little bit. Even it's almost as if to say that there's no perfect foot, or there's no perfect meter. Everything's measured off of this stick. And so the thing about this is that it's what we call, when we're employing meaning, when we're employing the word meaning, it's what we call a foot. It's what we call a meter. It's what is close enough to be considered that when we're using language, and that is what is the most natural use of a word that is literal, right? If you look up the etymology of literal, it literally is pointing to the opposition of its use to mean the strongest sense as opposed to the most natural sense. And so this very distinction is the hang-up that Anton has. This is the quirk that he seemed to linger on, that seemed to, instead of actually reading Wittgenstein, he would rather jump into this ontological mysticism and awe and ode and kowtow to zero and pi and these other and that which is infinite, instead of looking at the pragmatic use, what it is we call it, and saying that is what it is how it is we use it, and utilizing the meaning is use theory to comb over and understand how language is used. Instead of doing that, no, he wants to focus on zero as a negation of the real number line, instead of an absenting, a continuance but absenting of it, right? Okay, so all of that's out of the way. Now, as far as the, oh, what was I going to bring up? Now I lost my train of thought there. Okay. Well, maybe I need to stop the video now. But since this is for myself, it's just public, so people can jump in on that. Oh yeah, the paradox of that which is icon. He brings up index, icon, and symbol. Well, icon is the part of icon is like the meaning is use in a certain sense, in that it's trying to take similar things and make a rule that bounds that which is similar. And Wittgenstein was very particular about talking about what it means to follow a rule, even though the meter stick could change. And so what does it mean to say that a certain tone of red is like another tone of red, and so we're both going to call these reds, or that the letter A in one font is similar enough to be a letter A in another font as to justify calling it an A, and then to talk about that which is morphing fonts, or when you see certain graffitis and you can't make out any longer what the text is. It goes beyond your limits of being able to see the fontness or the likability of it, but it doesn't mean that it goes beyond somebody else's ability. And so I guess I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about the Piraha language also, because the Piraha language is like, I make an analogy to people that are colorblind. If somebody is red-orange colorblind, they can't tell the difference between red and orange. They don't have that similarity. That's the same thing with the Piraha, and so the Piraha don't count beyond 3, and so even the idea to say that they're doing anything, or beyond 5, or maybe beyond 10, that they don't have anything other than maybe an analog, if that, with their fingers, is kind of like an aspect blinding of the language. And so, once again, Anton still has not addressed languages. He calls it a sign system, right? Oh, these people are just using sign systems. Where I say, well, no, they're considered the most empirical of all humans, and they're considered the happiest of all humans by some meter of what happiness is. But this idea that the Piraha are not speaking, communicating individuals seems absurd. It seems that they are speaking, that they do have a language, but the fact that they're not socio-historic, they don't take the words that are written down, they don't read, they don't write, they only speak, so it's a wholly oral language, but they don't take on the words from other people who are not alive. They only trust the words that are coming out of other people's mouths as testimony. that's to the depth that the individual would be considered socio-historic, which is basically not any, like, that doesn't seem to do the job. But and so I still have yet to hear any basic I don't know, consolation from Anton about the Piraha language being uniquely distinct and different from the other individuals that the communications might take into consideration. And so, an absenting of zero, or like aspect blindness, like color blindness, the Piraha have absented a great many of the features of language that we have, that the majority of language speaking individuals have inherited, that the world population supposedly would like. And people are more concerned about whether or not they're genetically capable of it. And I'm more caught on the fact that it's a coherent language that has these structures that are absent. And so you're speaking to somebody that would be equivalent to speaking about color to a colorblind individual, or certain colors to a colorblind individual. So that's my thoughts on that. Now, as far as the icon, when you think about the similarity between things, and that we're trying to bring about icons and say this is like this enough that people will understand that this icon means that a trash can in your email is an icon for deleting the email. When we have that particular icon put out there, it's supposed to, there's still a conventional aspect to icons that we have to be able to understand, or that we don't, that we naturally, if you have a blue, even in the Matrix, grab the red pill or the blue pill, well, that red looked more magenta to me, so I'm not really seeing a red pill, Morpheus. You know what I'm saying? It's like you grab what is naturally closest to, which is naturally alike, this notion of red. Even the idea of a pure red or a perfect red seems to be something that we say is part of a wavelength that we count on. But I don't know if that has any degree of sensibility to it when you place it next to another, a contrasting color, or not, or if you are using like an LCD light as opposed to using reflective material to discuss that. So this part isn't that important to bring up distinctions. My biggest distinctions are still that there's no problem with zero, infinites, pi, circles. Circles are like the Tractatus. It's a two-dimensional outlining or bounding an item that if you moved a circle and you were to find or attempt to draw a perfect circle or have a computer do it, that what it has to do is it has to move into a 3D modeling which turns the circle, which is pi, basically into a spiral. And so the imperfection comes from rotating something that's a crystalline one-dimensional or two-dimensional, like Tractatus, logical approach to the world, and rotating it into a higher dimension so that you're able to get a spiral out of that circle. And that rotation is what it is that makes the distinction and the difference between, or what makes something to be considered perfect or imperfect. In that very hyperized literal sense. And so it's not that I don't don't disagree with Anton's criticisms of people that are trapped in trying to bring everything to a logical purity. Even the idea of saying, well, logic has perfect circles in it, and logic has infinites in it. That's fine. That's fine to say those things because it's a concept for infinity that means to continue on, to indefinitely continue on. And so you're utilizing non-reference, and if you do use a reference, you're automatically going to be referring to the guy that's talking or referring to the computer that's counting. But you are still pointing to those things because you have to look at how language is being taught to kids. How is it? And that's the one thing that Anton seems to be ignoring is how it is we're acquiring these concepts that he says have no reference, that I say they definitely have a reference, and they definitely have a naturally occurring reference. It's just that we extend, we take an epistemological, what I'll call like an innate telos or an innate idealism to the idea of that which is infinite. And part of what is being human or speaking the way that we speak is to be able to take one idea like counting and say continue counting and give examples of what it means to count higher and higher and have larger and larger numbers and get to Googles and Googleplexes and even higher numbers that are conceived, and to say add one to that and add another one to that and continue counting and to continue counting. And that what we're doing is we are actually using empirical referential items. So sorry, this may sound like a huge droll, a huge boron, or boring ramble. Okay, so let me see if I can skip over and clarify what I'm trying to get at with the icon part. The whole idea that there isn't a rule system for being able to recognize what is similar to something else. I mean, I could pick up a cup and pick up a trash can and find the similarities between the two. So the rules between orange, orange, red and orange, red, orange are as close and as far as a cup and a garbage can are in terms of our lingual capabilities of drawing similarity and trying to wrap a rule system around that which is iconistic, or that which is similar. Because kind of like two beats that you say are exactly the same, that you just cut and paste in a soundboard. Well, the difference between the two is that one comes prior to the other one. When you have A equals A, the difference between the A on the left side and the A on the right side is precisely that you have to have a convention of the read, a convention of the rule system, a natural process that says this one's on the left of the one on the right, and that is definitely different than being the one on the right that is different, than being the one on the right that is different from the one on the left. Anyway, so I've been going on for roughly a half hour now, and what I'm hoping by making this video public might do is to get some feedback from people as to whether or not, if they see the idea of negation, the idea of forming an opposite through the not operator, like that to me is a logical process. It's a two-dimensional process. It's what Wittgenstein did in the Tractatus. That's what caused the confusion between kind of a more ontological descriptions of language or of one's reality, and the argument between epistemology and ontology. Which one is predominant? Do we speak about natural language, or do we speak about knowledges and apply knowledges to natural language as being predominant over talking about natural occurrences and apply those to knowledges? And so my main criticism of Anton stands that all he's done is conflated the ontological side between ontology and epistemology. He's still trying to find a mysticism that conflates ontology, and that somehow he's found this in the zero, but the only way he's found it in the zero is when he considers the zero to be uh, part of the not operator. Now, I'm not saying that zero doesn't have a not operator use. I'm saying it has both. That the idea of saying that the not comes prior to absence or absence comes prior to not seems to be the distinction. It seems to be where the line is, but I mean, there's obviously both. But it's trying to boil down a primacy from which to make a convention, from which to hold an argument. But if you fall on one side of it, then Anton's making the same problem with the not operator that Wittgenstein made with the Tractatus. And yet immediately after he makes that, he skips over into speaking about natural language. Now, what else is odd about Anton? Um, yeah, yeah, I did all these videos about, yeah. Oh, okay. If you take if you take the nothing is real argument, I still don't like the idea of saying nothing is real unless it's not dissimilar to saying imagination is real. That you don't have an ostensible, demonstrable, objective entity to point at when one is speaking of their imagination. But if one looks at a painting or of a creation, one says this is an expression of one's imagination. But it is logically possible to not even have a brain, so to speak, and just be following an operation like a computer and produce an expression and not say that the computer's imagination. I mean, at that point, you'd be caught into metaphor. But I guess my big thing is that I think Anton is making a mountain out of a molehill, and he wants everyone else to aggrandize the problems that he sees as, first of all, to sense them as problems, which I do not. I do not sense these as problems. I sense these as blind spots that Anton has, and he's trying to inflame the bright spot and then justify it somehow by awing and oding over these words like infinity and zero and parallel lines. I mean, if you ask two kids, draw a couple parallel lines, and they go to the board and they draw them, then you have a couple parallel lines, right? It's not this idea of trying to measure perfection, right? I mean, we have perspective. And so to me, the whole notion, once again, is between two-dimensional and three-dimensionality. So I hope this isn't boring for anyone else. Like I said, this is just my reflections on Anton now. So when Anton does the nothing is real as opposed to nothing is void, right? The idea of a word or an item standing in the universe or in a lexicon in solidarity, punctuated away from its background, outlined and separated off. It's as if Anton wants it both ways. At one point, he'll speak about solidarity and punctuated lines and the not operator, which parenthetically segments and segues one item from another. And yet, at the same time, it's also congratulated and combined and mixed into the lexicon when you're speaking about words, or you're speaking about words in a dictionary or in an alphabet, letters in an alphabet. And so I don't think that there's any big mystery of this. I do have to congratulate Anton for getting into some of these detailed points and just working on it. Like, his oratory skills are fabulous. And he is a good teacher in that he knows how to reduce certain complexities and discuss them quickly. So he's efficient, and so granting him his value is in his efficiency, but I don't believe it's in his thesis. And so when you say thing is real and you make thing an equal sign, and so real and thing are two things, and you're referencing not imagination is real, not the reference, not the pointing or the trace off of a word that goes to another that is uh, pointing or referring to something else. Uh, but when you're doing a mathematical equation and you say thing is real, then or thing equals real, then if you're going to introduce no and make nothing is real on one side, then you have to put no on the other side. So you'd have nothing is no real. That's the only way to balance that equation. So, and then let's see if I can kind of like watching, I guess now watching Anton and Gary, like the other thing I like about Anton is that he's exploring the emotionality of things, right? He's an atheist, but he realizes that the lexicology of theologic types of words and phrases and figures mix in so normally and naturally within our day-to-day discourse in terms of metaphor and understanding of what God is, that we can't really separate ourselves from it. When we have a zeitgeist, we have a monotheism, we have our way of speaking about it that we're recording, and that hopefully, like the internet or our records, carry on to the next zeitgeist if we make a certain plurality about gods once again. I mean, there's spiritualism, the daemonic reality versus the eidetic realm, even the idea of speaking about a realm. This is the other thing I don't like. There seems to be this notion that the world first opens up a clearing for an item as opposed to an item pushing itself in, right? Like sculpting itself into reality. And that this seems to be a big idea. And so if you then take, it's almost like this other thing that Anton's eyeing about that I just don't see the value, and I think it's outrightly wrong and incorrect at times to speak about there being a clearing for everything that is. There is a clearing for it prior to its showing up. Otherwise, it couldn't have shown up. And that's an abuse of the ontological argument. That would be an abuse of discussions of language. That would be trying to say that the imagination needed you could say it needed a cosmological clearing for imagination to show up. I suppose that's okay. Or you needed a gap of imagination in order for imagination to show up. Like these things, people are free to figuratively speak about them in this way. But if one wants to stick with academia and one wants to ground themselves in certain processes of thinking, the idea of speaking about everything having to have a clearing prior to it showing up seems like a certain type of presuppositionalism, an assumptive base from which to speak about what is in a conventional ordering process, where the conventional ordering process, kind of like icon, trying to figure out what is like something else, well, it bumps into the problem with the nounus and verbus operation of language. And by that I mean, it would appear the idea of saying that one must have a clearing in order to speak about things that show up is similar to saying that one has to speak about a noun in order to speak about a verb in a sentence, right? Instead of like an onomatopoeic sentence just saying brum, period, right? Which is the noun and the verb if there's a noun or a verb in that sentence, and yet it's still there's sentences in books that are that way, right? That they're just onomatopoeic sentences, and they seem to take on a certain sensibility or a certain contextual meaning. And so there's this certain trap that I think Anton himself falls into. And it doesn't appear as if he recognizes the trap that he himself has fallen into. He is in his own fly bottle, and he hasn't escaped yet. And so, but he's able to, with his oratory skills, carry people through, put a ring through their nostril and guide them. But he's not freeing them. Like, he's giving them information to help uh, them, well, to free them in certain respects. But in these other respects, with regards to the zero and the infinite and the idea of saying that a negation of thingliness is as real as thingliness, is not a discourse in physics for Anton. It's a discourse in cosmology. And I think that there's just something about that still irritates me. And I think that what it is that it's in the convention of the noun-verb operation in sentences that confuse me, and that to watch somebody carry on as if they're speaking about facts instead of speaking about facts about conventions is what's irritating me. So I do watch Anton because he brings up old considerations that I once dealt with and tucked away in my past and then carried on into painting. And he's drumming them up again, so it's like my old college years coming up again. And I get so irritated that as a professor, he needs to lead and he doesn't want to show a weakness. He's so, it's so important for him to take on this predominant role and to remain with this hierarchical sort of predominance. Like his notion, when I brought up hierarchies a long time ago, immediately he brought up that which was better. Who was better, right? We can't get around who is better. Well, the idea of who is better is contextual around what game is being played, what thing is being honored, and or what use is being provided. And but my idea of hierarchical had more to do with pyramidical positionings as opposed to saying this person is better, therefore they're there. I mean, I've known plenty of painters that are technically worse than I am, who are better as artists than I am, right? And so just that difference between better and hierarchical, he never made the distinction between those two. That really pissed me off, is that I'm talking about social positioning as hierarchies. And I still think that hierarchies are first in the nounist position, in a solid state solidarity position, in a tractatus two-dimensional shape, or even in a three-dimensional shape, are like pyramids, like the great pyramids of Giza. But as a verbose form, like people traveling through time that are living and dying, like societies that move, like companies that go through a process of a lifestyle process, it's like a wave. It's like watching a water crest and dump over on itself and or fall back into itself and deflate. And these particular analogies seem to be more important to me when I'm speaking about hierarchies. But once again, it's more important to Anton to maintain face than to actually get to the rudiments of the problem. So if there's a problem, here's one problem for Anton. What what is it that makes us see similarity between dissimilar things? What is it about light and texture and size and color and context that allow us to say, and or use, that allow us to say uh, apples and oranges, and to make the distinction within a group that is greater or is more similar than a distinction outside of the group? Because you could mix apples and oranges and say, well, the red apples are closer to oranges than the Granny Smith green apples are closer to oranges, and start moving the context over to color, something to that effect. Anyway, I don't know whether or not this has just been an entire worthless babble, but if anybody else sees these problems that I believe are philosophically rooted in Anton's words and discourse, right, if they still maintain criticism of Anton or his approach, the limitations of what it is, how it is he comes off, and what it is he continues to harp on and echo on, right? If anyone can see distinct philosophical issues with Anton that are similar to my own, I'm always curious of who has those same insights or what references they might utilize in order to speak about those things. Now, I decided to make this video because it's long enough for a painkiller to kick in. So I think that the painkiller is now kicked in, and so I'm free to go. I do have a few more minutes, so let me talk a little bit more about Anton's relationship with, like, Gary. I do think in order to do that, Gary has to be outlined a little bit, and so I do like Anton's approaching Gary, because Gary seems to have, like, Gary does say that suffering is the currency of the universe, which to me just means that's what he's focused on, that's what he cares about. It has nothing to do with there being any actual currency, but by currency he just means value, the value of the universe, that we move back and forth between a natural acceptable state of being and an unacceptable state of being that we call suffering and or pain. And I've already gone over that, where Anton wants to comb over and shadow cast pain and suffering in the life discourse. And so I appreciate that also. I appreciate the fact that he would cover it up, but he doesn't, unlike Gary, he doesn't take a particular behavioral stance on veganism. You know, he said something to the effect is he doesn't eat a lot of meat, but if it's served to him, he'll eat it. And I happen to agree with that policy. That seems to be my policy as well, because I once saw a chef say that the reason that they're not vegetarian or vegan is because they want to keep the palate open. Meaning they want to keep their cooking palate, not their mouth palate, open, as far as being able for the artistic natures of cooking. But as far as implementing a truth value based on suffering and based on life, I disagree with Gary Amendams that life was imposed upon an individual because the concurrence. Well, this should be for another video. I'm not going to go into this right now, and I've already done it. But I guess I just once again wanted to make this video to kind of watch later and see what it is I did and didn't cover, because I don't think I covered a whole bunch. Anyway, sorry if you sat through all this. It's a long babble, but feel free to leave a comment, rate, like, and comment, and subscribe, or not. Anyway, word to your mother.